Okay, on the last video, we went over the skull and we went over the spinal column. Now in this video, we're going to be looking at the bony thorax, or what you may have called the thoracic cage. The thoracic cage itself is made up of the sternum, the ribs, the costal cartilages, and the thoracic vertebrae. The thoracic vertebrae are going to be the most posterior, whereas the costal cartilages are going to be closer to the anterior, connecting the ribs to the sternum. The functions of the thoracic cage include protecting organs like the lungs, and protecting things like the heart, so protecting the pleural and pericardial cavities. We're also going to see a lot of support for the shoulder girdles made up of the clavicle and the scapula, and even the bones of the upper limbs. There's attachment for plenty of neck, back, chest, and shoulder muscles, and we're going to see intercostal muscles in between the ribs, which are part of the thoracic cage, and they're going to make sure that breathing can occur because they're able to lift and depress the thorax during that process of respiration. So here's the basic structure of the thoracic cage. Again, you can see in the back we have the vertebrae. It's going to be the thoracic vertebrae. In the front we have the sternum. You may know that as the breastbone. The top of the sternum is called the manubrium. Then you have the body in the middle. And then down here shown is cartilage of the xiphoid process. The xiphoid process is the last bone to ossify, so oftentimes it is depicted still as cartilage. Then you have this other cartilage, which is attaching the ribs anteriorly to the sternum, that's costal cartilage, and all of this is hyaline cartilage. You have at the top of the manubrium a jugular and clavicular notch. Part of the clavicle will attach to the clavicular notch. And then you have the ribs themselves, and we have true ribs, false ribs, and floating ribs, so more on those in a second. So more on ribs, there's 12 pair of ribs, so 12 pairs. They're going to flare on the sides from the thoracic vertebrae up towards the sternum. So while all ribs attach posteriorly to thoracic vertebrae, some of them attach anteriorly to the sternum. The 7 pairs, the superior 7 pairs, they're the true or vertebrosternal ribs, and that means that they're the ones that are attaching anteriorly to the sternum directly. So they're using their own separate costal cartilages to directly attach to the sternum. Then you have pairs 8 through 10. These are the false or vertebrochondral ribs. They're attaching indirectly because they have to share a costal cartilage in order to attach to the sternum. Then ribs 11 and 12 are the floating or vertebral ribs, and they have no anterior attachment to the sternum. Now we've finished talking about the axial skeleton. So we have to move then to our next division, which is the appendicular skeleton. And we can't forget that to get to the appendicular skeleton, we have to talk about the pectoral and pelvic girdles, because the girdles of the upper and lower limb are what attach the appendicular skeleton to the axial skeleton. Again, the pectoral girdle is made up of the clavicles and the scapula, and the pelvic girdle is made up of the 2 pelvic bones, or you can call them the coxal bones. There are a total of 30 bones in each upper and lower limb. So let's start with the pelvic or the pectoral girdle. Again, clavicle, scapula is our main 2 bones here, and we're looking at the scapula in this view. Some points to show you are the acromion, coracoid process, and the glenoid cavity, also known as the glenoid fossa. The glenoid fossa is where the humerus, the head of the humerus, would attach. The coracoid process is going to be slightly anterior to the acromion, and part of the other side of the clavicle is going to attach to the acromion. So the clavicle actually has an acromial end and a clavicular end, and attaches to the clavicular notch of the sternum, and the acromion end attaches to the acromion of the scapula. So here's just another view of the pectoral girdle. We looked at the scapula. You can see the acromion a little bit behind the coracoid. Here's the clavicle attaching to the clavicular notch via the sternoclavicular joint, and then attaching to the acromion via the acromioclavicular joint. Then you also have, you can see the ribs are in front of the scapula, but the head of the humerus is at the glenoid fossa or glenoid cavity. The coracoid and parts of the glenoid cavity are going to be attachment points for muscles or tendons. So you can see some of them here, those of the biceps brachii and the brachioradialis. There's also things like bursa, which we'll talk more about in chapter 8. So these are just fluid-filled sacs that help reduce friction. You can see other muscles that are attached under the scapula, so they're subscapular. Others still behind the spine. So plenty of attachment points for ligaments, tendons, locations for bursa. And that allows us to move away from the pectoral girdle and into the actual bones of the upper extremities. So this includes the arm, the forearm, and the hand. In the arm, you would have the humerus, which you've already seen a picture of. In the forearm, you would have the radius and the ulna. And in anatomical position, the radius is on the side of the thumb, whereas the ulna is on the side of the pinky finger. Your carpals are your wrist bones, so they're all short bones. Your finger bones and the phalanges are all long bones. And they're going to be found down here in the hand. Here we have an anterior view of the right hand, so we're just getting a better view of that particular structure. Again, carpals are your wrist bone, metacarpals, think of them as your palm bone, and the phalanges are your fingers. And you have a proximal, middle, and distal bone of the phalanges. Proximal is closest to the metacarpals, distal is further away, and of course middle is intermediate. The carpals again are short bones. They consist of hamate, pisiform, triquetral, lunate, trapezoid, trapezium, scaphoid, and capitate. Then you have the ulna over here near the pinky, radius over here near the thumb, and they are going to articulate with the carpal bones. Next, let's look at the pelvic girdle, and then we'll move on to the lower limbs. So you can see how at the sacroiliac joint, the sacrum is going to articulate with the coxal bones, or your hip bone. You can also see different names for stuff in the hip, and that's because the hip bones themselves are made up of 3 fused bones. They are made up of the ilium, pubis, and ischium. Those are the 3 bones. So oftentimes different parts of the coxal bone will have names based on what bone they're made up of. Like, for example, the pubic arch is made up of areas of the pubis. You have the pubic crest near the pubis. We have the iliac crest up here near the ilium. You have the ischial spine on the ischium. And these names do take on where they are in the coxal bone, but keep in mind that the pelvic bone, coxal bone, those names are for the whole of the bone, whereas if you're asked for one of the 3 separate bones that make up the coxal bone, they'd be asking you about ilium, pubis, or ischium. A major structure on the pelvic bones is the acetabulum. You can also call it the acetabulum. This is a really deep cavity where the head of the femur would sit. Next, we're going to compare the male and female pelvis. So the female pelvis is going to be tilted forward. It's an adaptation for childbearing. And the true pelvis is the space that's made in the middle of the pelvis. Same goes for males and females. And the true pelvis of females is actually kind of characterized or structured for childbirth. So it's going to be a little more shallow, it's going to have greater capacity, it's very broad. Also, the female pelvis is lighter, thinner, and smoother than the heavier, thicker, and more prominent male pelvis. But the biggest giveaway, if you're just looking at 2 different pelvi in order to determine which one's male and which one's female, is going to be the angle of the pubic arch. The angle of the female pubic arch is larger than the angle of the male pubic arch, and I'll show you an image in just a moment. Also, the acetabula are small and farther apart because of the angle for the female pelvis versus large and closer together because of the angle for the male pelvis. And the coccyx in the female pelvis is going to be a little bit more movable, straighter, so it's not in the way of the true pelvis or the birth canal in order to allow for childbirth. So here we have the male and female pelvis. I'll give you a minute just to see if you can figure out which one's male and which one's female. Okay, so if you said that the pelvis on your left, so if you're looking at the PowerPoint, pelvis on the left is female, you are correct. It has the largest pubic arch, it has a wide pelvic brim. It itself is broader and shallower, and it has a coccyx or a tailbone that's a little more out of the way, a little more straight. Whereas we have a smaller pubic arch over here on the right, a less broad pelvic brim, a longer pelvis in general, and a coccyx that's definitely in the way of the true pelvis. So the one on the right, if you're looking at the PowerPoint, that would be the male pelvis. Next, let's look at the lower extremities. So 3 different regions, just like we had 3 different regions for the upper limb. We have the thigh, leg, and foot. The thigh is formed by the femur, which is the largest long bone in the human body. In between the thigh and the leg, you have the patella. So that's a sesamoid bone anterior to the joint between the femur and the tibia. Then in the leg, you have the tibia and the fibula. The fibula is always lateral. The tibia is always medial. And make sure you don't get these names mixed up. Don't say tibula or fibia. It's tibia and fibula. Then you have the ankle. That's called the tarsals. Then you have kind of the main part of your foot. That's the metatarsals. And the toes are the phalanges. So if we're looking at the foot more, we can actually see all of the tarsals. You have 3 called cuneiform, but you have a medial, intermediate, and lateral cuneiform. Notice the lateral cuneiform is the most lateral, so near the pinky toe. And then you have the medial cuneiform near the big toe. Then behind the cuneiform is the navicular, then talus. Talus is what the tibia sits on. Under that is the calcaneus, and in front of the calcaneus was the cuboid. So that's the foot. And that's it for chapter 7. So make sure to go back, review bones. A lot of this information is also available in parts of chapter 6 and 8, and it's really going to help you understand those 2 chapters as well.